They called him insane. They said he was obsessed, wasting time chasing ghosts in the deep. But when America's deadliest weapon kept missing its targets, when submarines returned home after risking their lives, with nothing to show but empty torpedo tubes, this one mad admiral refused to accept the lies. He didn't just fight the enemy in the Pacific. He fought his own navy, and what he uncovered would change the course of the entire undersea war. It was early 1942. The U.S. Navy had entered World War II confident, maybe even arrogant, about its submarine force. They believed their Mark 14 torpedo was a masterpiece of modern engineering.
Fast, deadly, unstoppable.
But beneath the waves, truth was far darker. Patrol after patrol, submarine captains reported the same nightmare. Torpedoes fired at perfect angles, at point-blank range, slamming into enemy ships, and not exploding. Sometimes they ran too deep and passed harmlessly beneath the target. Sometimes they exploded too early, giving the enemy time to dodge. And sometimes they simply failed altogether. At first, the Navy didn't want to believe it. The Bureau of Ordnance, the proud department responsible for these torpedoes, blamed the men. They said, "The captains must be missing their targets. They must be nervous. They must be inexperienced." But these weren't rookies. They were hardened officers, men who had spent years beneath the ocean, trained for the impossible. And they knew something was wrong. Still, every complaint was dismissed. Every failure report was buried under paperwork. Every commander who dared to speak out was labeled as making excuses. But among those whispers of frustration, one voice refused to go silent. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of submarine forces, Pacific Fleet. A calm, methodical man by nature, but when his crews began dying because of faulty weapons, something inside him broke. He began reading every patrol report himself. Dozens, then hundreds. Every pattern told the same story. The torpedoes weren't broken once or twice, they were consistently unreliable. It wasn't operator error. It was a design flaw. Lockwood called an emergency meeting. He stood before senior officers and engineers, and with controlled anger in his voice, said, "If the Bureau of Ordnance doesn't believe our submarines, then I suggest they climb aboard one and fire their own damn torpedoes." Silence filled the room. No one dared respond. But behind closed doors, Lockwood made a decision that would change everything. He was going to test the torpedoes himself. Not in theory, not on paper, but in the real ocean with real targets. It was a decision the Navy didn't authorize, and frankly didn't want. Lockwood ordered his men to rig an old, decommissioned ship as a test target. He personally oversaw the loading of Mark 14 torpedoes, standing on the deck under the burning Hawaiian sun, watching his men prepare what could be a career-ending experiment. As the first torpedo was fired, everyone watched in silence. The water roared, the wake cut through the waves, and thud, perfect hit. But there was no explosion. Lockwood's jaw tightened. He ordered another shot. Same result, impact, but no detonation. For a man who had commanded submarines for decades, who had trusted these weapons to protect his sailors, the truth hit like a knife. The Navy's most advanced torpedo was a failure, but it wasn't enough just to see it fail. He needed to prove it beyond denial, beyond excuses. Lockwood instructed his engineers to recover the dud torpedoes, to dissect them piece by piece, to find the ghost hiding inside the metal. Days turned into weeks. Reports piled up, and what they found was horrifying. The magnetic exploder, a supposedly revolutionary mechanism designed to trigger the warhead when it passed beneath a ship, was malfunctioning. It was too sensitive, too unstable, and worse, it was being affected by Earth's magnetic field, meaning the same torpedo worked differently in different oceans. The Pacific's magnetic field strength was throwing the mechanism off entirely. So instead of detonating under the ship's keel as intended, it never exploded at all. The realization was explosive in its own right. It meant that the entire Pacific campaign, every attack, every patrol, every risk, had been fought with weapons that literally couldn't kill. Lockwood's anger reached boiling point. He sent a classified telegram to Washington, reporting his findings and demanding the magnetic exploders be disabled immediately. But the Bureau of Ordnance fired back, calling his tests unofficial, his conclusions unscientific. They told him to stop, to follow orders, to keep using the torpedoes as they were. It was madness. Lockwood couldn't accept it. He looked at the faces of his submarine crews, young, exhausted, proud, and he realized that the real enemy wasn't across the Pacific. It was sitting behind a desk in Washington. So he made a decision that would define him forever. He was going to defy orders. Under the cover of night, Lockwood authorized every submarine under his command to disable their magnetic exploders. He knew it was technically treason, but morally it was justice, and the results were immediate. The very next patrols began returning with confirmed sinkings. Enemy ships destroyed. Crews finally seeing explosions light up the night again. It was working. The mad admiral had been right all along. But the story didn't end there, because even after fixing the exploder, another problem lurked. One that would push Lockwood to his breaking point. When Admiral Charles Lockwood gave the order to disable the magnetic exploders, he thought the nightmare was finally over. For the first time in months, submarines were returning with real victories. Japanese merchant ships were burning, convoys were breaking apart, and submarine captains were sending back messages filled with relief and pride. It seemed like Lockwood's defiance had paid off. But beneath the celebration, something still wasn't right. Because even with the magnetic trigger turned off, torpedoes were still failing. The reports started small, just a few strange incidents. A captain would report a torpedo striking the hull of a Japanese freighter. A perfect hit, right where it should have torn through the ship's heart. But instead of exploding, it just bounced off. They called it the dud hit, a sickening sound that echoed through the steel of a submarine. The thud of failure, the silence of death. At first, some thought it was bad luck. But when dozens of submarines reported the same thing, Lockwood knew there was another ghost hiding in his weapons. The magnetic exploder had been the first lie. Now he was about to uncover the second one. In mid-1943, Lockwood ordered a new round of field tests, this time on the contact exploder, the backup mechanism that was supposed to detonate the torpedo on direct impact. Once again, the Bureau of Ordnance tried to stop him. They sent messages filled with bureaucratic language. Testing unnecessary. Reports exaggerated. Weapons functioning within design tolerance. But Lockwood had heard those excuses before, and he was done listening. He gathered his most trusted officers and engineers. They found an isolated stretch of sea near Hawaii, secured an old steel hulk as a target, and began the tests again. As the first torpedo streaked through the water and struck the target, the crew braced for the explosion. Nothing, just a dull clang. They tried again. Another torpedo, another perfect hit, another failure. Lockwood's face darkened. He knew what this meant. The contact exploder itself was defective. They recovered the duds again, pulling the heavy, waterlogged torpedoes back aboard. When the engineers opened them up, they discovered the fatal flaw, the firing pin mechanism. The Mark 14's contact exploder was designed with a firing pin that had to strike a detonator when the torpedo hit a target. On paper, it looked flawless, but in reality, it was too fragile. At high speeds, especially after traveling long distances, the torpedo's sudden deceleration on impact bent or jammed the firing pin assembly. So instead of hitting the detonator, it locked in place. In simple words, the harder the torpedo hit, the less likely it was to explode. It was an engineering tragedy, and a moral one. Lockwood couldn't believe what he was reading in the engineers' reports. It wasn't just a technical oversight. It was proof that the Bureau of Ordnance had never properly tested the Mark 14 under real combat conditions. They had fired them in calm, shallow waters at slow speeds, with perfectly aligned angles, conditions that never existed in real warfare. And now, thousands of sailors were paying the price. When Lockwood confronted Washington again, their response was the same cold arrogance. Your tests are not authorized. The design has passed all trials. But Lockwood had had enough of trials. He wanted truth. So, in one of the boldest moves of the war, he sent a message directly to Admiral Chester Nimitz, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. He laid out every piece of evidence. The dud torpedoes, the test data, the wreckage, the reports. Nimitz trusted Lockwood. He had seen the man's results firsthand. And with that trust, he gave Lockwood something no one else could. Full authority to fix the problem his way. Lockwood's engineers began redesigning the firing pin immediately. They tested dozens of configurations, stronger metals, different angles, new springs. They built experimental devices in makeshift workshops near Pearl Harbor, testing each one with live explosives, risking their lives every single time. The final breakthrough came when a young ordnance officer suggested something radical. If the pin can't hit the detonator straight, make it hit from the side. It sounded insane, but they tried it. And when that torpedo hit the target, a thunderous explosion ripped through the ocean. It worked. Finally worked. For the first time in over a year, Lockwood stood on deck watching a column of smoke rise into the sky, and he smiled. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was justice. With both the magnetic and contact exploders finally fixed, the Mark 14 torpedo became the weapon it was always meant to be. Submarines returned to the Pacific with a new confidence. Captains who had once cursed their weapons now fired with precision and fury. Japanese convoys began vanishing. Merchant fleets that had once sailed freely now moved under constant threat. In just a few months, the submarine campaign shifted from frustration to dominance. But behind every victory report, every ship sunk, every convoy destroyed, Lockwood knew there was a cost that could never be repaid. Too many crews had died before the truth came out. Too many submarines had been lost because someone in Washington refused to admit they were wrong. He carried that guilt quietly, writing in his journal one night, "Our boys were brave enough to face the enemy. The least we could have done was give them a weapon that worked." And though Lockwood never sought fame, his name became a legend among submariners. They called him the man who fought two wars, one against Japan and one against his own navy. By late 1944, U.S. submarines were sinking over 50% of Japan's merchant fleet. The Pacific War had turned. Supplies couldn't reach the front lines. Factories couldn't build enough replacements. And Japan's war machine began to starve. That victory, quiet, unseen, deep beneath the waves, belonged to every submariner who fired those torpedoes. But it also belonged to the man who refused to believe a lie. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood didn't just fix a weapon. He restored faith in an entire fighting force. The Pacific had changed. By late 1943, the once invincible Japanese convoys were breaking apart like driftwood in a storm. Submarines that had once returned home empty and defeated were now coming back with their decks lined in victory flags, each one marking a sunken enemy ship. But Admiral Charles Lockwood didn't celebrate. He stood on the pier in Pearl Harbor, watching the submarines roll in, their crews cheering, their faces lit with triumph, and all he could think was, what took us so long to get here? Because behind every successful patrol were months of failure, and the graves of men who never got to fire a working torpedo. The new Mark 14s, finally fixed, were now performing with terrifying precision. Torpedoes detonated on contact, ran true to depth, and struck with the fury they'd always promised. Each explosion out at sea was a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. Lockwood often said to his staff, "A working weapon is justice for the dead, but it'll never bring them back." He meant every word. By early 1944, the U.S. submarine fleet had become the most feared weapon in the Pacific. Less than 2% of the Navy's manpower, yet responsible for sinking more than half of Japan's shipping. Convoy routes that had once been Japan's lifeline were now hunting grounds. Oil tankers, troop transports, ammunition ships, all gone. Every time the periscope rose above the waves, another Japanese flag went under. But as the victories grew, so did the burden. Lockwood began to notice something in the reports. Something human, something painful. Captains writing lines that didn't sound like triumph. One message read, "Target destroyed. No survivors visible." Another, "We hit an oil convoy. Fire spread for miles. The ocean burned all night." And another, written by a young lieutenant, "Sir, it's strange, we're winning, but it doesn't feel like it." That's when Lockwood realized his men weren't fighting an enemy anymore. They were fighting their own reflection. Because once the torpedoes started working, the destruction was absolute. Japanese sailors never stood a chance. Convoys had no defense against the silent hunters below the surface. Submarine warfare wasn't about glory. It was about patience, silence, and then a single devastating moment. And when the silence returned, all that remained was debris and guilt. One night, a submarine called USS Tang returned from a mission that should have been celebrated. It had sunk 6 enemy ships in a single patrol, a record-breaking feat. But when the crew stepped onto the dock, their eyes were hollow. Lockwood met them personally. He congratulated the captain, Richard O'Kane, one of his finest officers. But O'Kane didn't smile. He said quietly, "Sir, we did our job, but I keep seeing the faces, the ones who jumped into the water." Lockwood said nothing for a long moment. Then he put a hand on O'Kane's shoulder and replied, "War makes us do what peace can't forgive. But it's the only way peace ever comes." Still, Lockwood carried that conversation with him for the rest of his life. Because he knew the better he made his weapons, the heavier their cost became. He wasn't just fixing machines anymore. He was shaping history, and that history came soaked in oil and blood. But his fight wasn't over yet. Even as America's submarine fleet dominated the Pacific, Lockwood continued to battle his other enemy, the Navy's bureaucracy. There were still officials back in Washington who resented him, who thought he'd overstepped by defying the Bureau of Ordnance. They tried to paint him as reckless, emotional, even dangerous. But Lockwood didn't care about politics. He only cared about his men. When one officer warned him, "Sir, you're making powerful enemies," he simply replied, "The only enemies I care about are the ones trying to kill my boys." And those boys, as he called them, worshipped him for it. To the submariners of the Pacific, Admiral Charles Lockwood wasn't just their commander. He was their shield. He fought the system so they could fight the war. They called him Uncle Charlie, the kind of leader who'd walk the docks, shake every sailor's hand, and remember their names. The kind who'd stay up all night waiting for a submarine overdue by a single hour. When a sub didn't return, Lockwood didn't hide behind reports. He stood on the pier, eyes fixed on the horizon, refusing to leave until someone told him it was gone for good. And there were many that never came back. The ocean around Japan became a graveyard, not just for the enemy, but for hundreds of American submariners too. Every victory had a shadow. Lockwood would read the casualty lists in silence. He never let his men see him break. But sometimes, when the office lights went out, he'd sit alone at his desk, a stack of letters in front of him, letters he had to sign and send to mothers, wives, children. Each one began the same way. "The Navy Department regrets to inform you." Each one felt like another piece of his soul being welded to the war he could never escape. Still, he pressed on. Because he believed if he could make every weapon work, every submarine survive one more mission, then maybe those letters would stop. It was hope that kept him moving. Hope and guilt. In early 1945, as Japan's empire began to crumble, Lockwood's submarines were ordered to tighten the noose. Their mission: cut off every last supply line, sink everything that moved. And they did. Merchant fleets vanished. Isolated garrisons starved. Japan's economy, its lifeline, collapsed beneath the waves. It was brutal, relentless, and effective. But even in victory, Lockwood saw tragedy. Because when he read the final reports, enemy vessel destroyed, convoy sunk, target neutralized, he also saw what wasn't written: the faces beneath the waves, the silence that followed every explosion. One of his officers once asked him, "Sir, how do you sleep knowing how many men we've killed?" Lockwood stared out at the ocean and said, "I don't count the dead. I count the living who'll make it home because of them." That was Lockwood, a man torn between justice and mercy, between invention and destruction. He didn't fight for revenge. He fought for redemption, for every sailor who'd gone down firing broken torpedoes that should have worked. Now, they finally did. By the spring of 1945, U.S. submarines had sunk over 5 million tons of Japanese shipping. They had done what no air raid or battleship fleet could achieve. They had strangled an empire one torpedo at a time. Lockwood watched as the Pacific War drew to its brutal end. He knew his men had helped shorten it, maybe saved millions of lives on both sides. But that didn't make the silence easier. War had a way of punishing the living just as much as the dead. One night, after hearing that another of his submarines, the USS Tang, had been lost due to a torpedo malfunction that caused it to circle back and explode, Lockwood sat quietly in his office. He didn't speak. He didn't rage. He just lowered his head and whispered, "Even the best machine can't fix the chaos of war." Because that was the truth he'd spent years learning. You can fix steel. You can fix wires. But you can't fix the cost of what they do once they work. The war was ending. Japan was on its knees. Cities lay in ruins, convoys destroyed, skies empty of planes. But on the morning of August 15, 1945, when the radio announced Japan's surrender, Admiral Charles Lockwood didn't cheer. He just sat in silence. The men around him jumped, shouted, and cried. Sailors hugged each other. Officers threw their caps into the air. The nightmare was finally over. But for Lockwood, it wasn't. Because as the noise of celebration filled Pearl Harbor, his mind wasn't on victory. It was on the 52 submarines that never came back. 52 boats. 3,500 men. Lost beneath the waves, the quiet cost of the silent service. And Lockwood knew most of their names. He walked out to the edge of the dock. The same dock he had stood on countless nights, waiting for submarines that never returned. The sea was calm now, almost too calm. He stared out at it and whispered, "You took too many of them. Far too many." Because while the world celebrated peace, Lockwood could still hear the echoes of depth charges, the cries through broken radios, and the silence that followed. That silence never left him. In the weeks after the surrender, Pearl Harbor changed overnight. Submarines returned home one by one, some limping, some shining like steel ghosts. The crews came ashore, sunburned and exhausted. Heroes in every sense. But for every crew that returned, there were families still waiting for someone who never would. Lockwood made it his duty to meet them, to stand in front of mothers and wives and fiancés, and tell them in person what their men had done and how bravely they'd fought. He never sent officers to do it for him. He believed the truth, no matter how painful, should come from his own voice. One widow asked him through tears, "Did my husband suffer?" Lockwood swallowed hard. He wanted to lie, to say it was quick, but he couldn't. So he said softly, "Ma'am, he fought until the very end. He made sure his men had a chance. He did his duty." And she thanked him. That's what broke him. They always thanked him. The Navy offered Lockwood a promotion, a desk in Washington, maybe even a medal ceremony. He refused. He didn't want medals. He wanted memories to stop haunting him. He once told a friend, "The war may be over, but my part of it will never end. I'll be fighting it every night in my sleep." And he did. In the years that followed, Lockwood became known as one of the great figures of naval history, the admiral who turned America's submarine fleet from a failure into a force that crippled an empire. But to him, that wasn't glory. It was redemption. He had spent years battling the Navy's bureaucracy, writing angry letters, smashing through red tape, risking his career, just to prove what the frontline sailors already knew. The problem isn't the men, it's the weapon. And when he was finally proven right, when the torpedoes worked, when the war turned, it came too late for thousands of men who had died firing duds. That truth never left him. One evening in 1946, Lockwood was invited to speak at a ceremony in San Francisco. It was supposed to be a celebration of submarine success, a victory banquet. But when he stepped up to the microphone, he didn't talk about victory. He didn't talk about tonnage sunk or ships destroyed. He talked about loss. He looked out over the room, at the young faces, the veterans, the Gold Star families, and said, "If history remembers me for anything, let it not be the tonnage we sank, but the courage of the men who went to sea knowing their weapons might fail, and went anyway." The room fell silent. You could hear the clinking of glasses stop. You could see the eyes of grown men fill with tears, because every sailor in that room knew exactly what he meant. In the years that followed, Lockwood retired to Hawaii. He bought a small house overlooking the ocean, the same ocean that had taken so much from him. Every morning, he'd walk down to the water with a cup of coffee and just stand there, watching the horizon. Neighbors said he rarely talked about the war, but sometimes, when he looked out at the waves, he'd murmur something under his breath, as if speaking to ghosts only he could see. Once, a young sailor who recognized him came up and asked, "Sir, if you could do it all again, would you still fix the torpedo?" Lockwood smiled faintly. "Of course," he said, "because if we hadn't, more of you would have never come home." Then he paused and added quietly, "But I'd trade every working torpedo in the world for one more of the boys we lost." He lived the rest of his life with that balance. Pride and grief. He knew that the Mark 14, once hated, had become the weapon that ended the Pacific War faster. But he also knew its failures had killed as many Americans as enemies. When historians later wrote about him, they called him the admiral who fought 2 wars, one against Japan and one against the Navy. And that was true, because Lockwood's greatest victory wasn't sinking ships. It was proving that truth, even in war, mattered more than politics. In his later years, when journalists asked him about his legacy, Lockwood would just chuckle and say, "I'm no hero. I just hated seeing good men die for bad machines." He'd wave them off, light his pipe, and go back to staring at the horizon. When he died in 1967, the Navy buried him with full honors at Pearl Harbor, the same place where his fight had begun. Submariners from across the country came to pay their respects. Men who had once called him Uncle Charlie. During the ceremony, one of his former captains, a man who had lost half his crew during the war, stepped up to the podium. He didn't read from a speech. He just looked at Lockwood's flag-draped casket and said, "He wasn't just our commander. He was the reason we came home." Then, one by one, the sailors removed their caps. The sea breeze caught them, and for a moment, it felt like every soul lost beneath those waves was there, listening. Today, few remember the name Charles Lockwood. His face isn't on posters or in history books. But every submarine that sails, every weapon that works, every sailor who returns home safe, carries a piece of his legacy. Because he was the man who refused to accept failure. The man who shouted when others stayed silent. The man who fought not just for victory, but for truth. And in the end, that was his real war. Not against Japan, not against the ocean, but against the arrogance that said, "The system is fine, even when it's broken." Charles Lockwood proved that sometimes, one man's defiance can save thousands. He proved that courage isn't always pulling a trigger. Sometimes it's asking why the trigger doesn't work. As the sun set that day over Pearl Harbor, a lone submarine slipped out to sea, its torpedoes armed, its engines humming, its crew alive because one mad admiral refused to accept defeat. The waves closed behind it, silent and endless. And for a moment it almost felt like the ocean itself saluted.